Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I wanted to talk about a book that I read recently, one that is about slavery and ghosts, but mostly slavery. I am referring to Beloved by Toni Morrison. A pretty, bland cover. Not a lot going on there, but probably that's for a good reason. Meanwhile, on the back there is Toni Morrison, who died in 2019. So for those who don't know, Toni Morrison is a black author known for writing a lot of books about the experience of black individuals in the United States. Besides Beloved, she also wrote The Bluest Eye, which I have heard of, and Tar Baby, which I didn't, among other things. She's written essays, nonfiction plays, including one called Desdemona, which she was a character in Othello, so maybe she's just writing a character piece about that specific person. And she was well regarded in her time, winning a number of awards and being well received critically. There were a number of problems with her books, which this book has a few critics of that I'll note later on. But for the most part, people seem to value her work and see her as one of the premier black voices in American literature. So I had never read Toni Morrison before. It's mainly I've always known about her work because I saw it, like it was in my high school library and the local public library growing up, but I just never bothered to go out and read these books, probably because no one ever told me to. Probably what it's like growing up in rural Iowa, but I did want to check them out for this channel, noting that I had a gap in Toni Morrison, also a gap in black literature that I'm hoping to fill. So without further ado, let's talk about Beloved. I'll do a little summary, a little analysis, and we will move on from there. So Beloved focuses on a former slave named Seth. I believe that's how you pronounce the name. It's Seth with an E at the end. And her daughter Denver, as they live in Ohio. Seth formerly had 3 other children, a daughter who died, and that'll be explained a little more later in the story, and two boys who ran away because Seth insists that their house is haunted. Seth also had a husband who I think died. It's not really clear to me what happened. It's hard to follow the book sometimes. And a mother-in-law named Baby Suggs, who died shortly before the events of this story. Again, they live in Ohio. They live in a place called 124 on Bluestone Road, and they're kind of seen as social pariahs in the community because of something that happened in the past that we'll get to in a bit. But yeah, so Denver is shy and introverted and doesn't really talk to other people in the community. Really the only person she has contact with is her mother. So one day, Paul D., a man from Seth's past, shows up. They both worked at Sweet Home. They were both slaves at Sweet Home. And after Seth ran away, Paul D. eventually found his way to the north, and he heard that Seth was living in Ohio and wanted to check in on her, especially because he had a thing for her in the past when she was married, and now that she's not married, he wants to see if he can hit that, which is that's what it definitely seems like is his aim in this story. So they do begin a relationship. Paul D. finds out that the house is haunted by the ghost of Seth's baby. that died in the past. And Paul D works to exorcise this baby, which seems to work, and lifts everyone's spirits and allows Paul's and Seth's relationship to flourish. They even go out to the carnival where everyone has a great time. However, unfortunately, when they arrive back in the home, they discover that a mysterious woman has shown up who identifies herself only as Beloved. Paul is very suspicious of this woman, not understanding what her motives are, but Seth takes to her quickly and nurses her back to health, and they become fast friends. Even Denver views this woman as someone to be around and begins to make friends with her. Obviously, this person is a ghost, given what just previously happened in the story. A person showing up mysteriously, that's really suspicious. And I'm surprised the other characters in the story don't identify that immediately, given how quick they were to believe that a baby was haunting their house not too long ago. But Denver quickly catches on to it and tries not to say anything, because this is the sister that she wanted to be with for so long, but was dead, so she couldn't be with her. Although Paul is suspicious of Beloved, she entices him to have sex or something. It takes two to tango, buddy, so you're not faultless here. This ends up putting some tension on his relationship with Seth. But to make things better, he tells her that he wants to have a baby with her in order to start a new life. And Seth is agreeable to this, although Paul doesn't seem to be doing it for the right reasons. Eventually, from one of the members of the community, Paul learns that the reason that Seth's daughter had died so long ago is because Seth killed the baby. Seth had seen some slave catchers showing up, and she was a runaway slave and did not want to be returned to Sweet Home, where she was being beaten and tormented and other such things, and didn't want to be separated from her children. And so she went to the shed with all four of her children and tried to kill them. And she only succeeded with killing her oldest daughter first. And when the slave catchers saw this, they arrested her, but they also realized they couldn't take the children home because they were damaged property, which is terrible. That the only thing stopping them was the fact that they're broken stock or something like that. And so because of this, Seth is a pariah in the community. Paul is kind of shocked by all this too, and he decides to leave for the time being. At this point, Seth realizes the truth about Beloved, that she is her dead daughter, come back to life as a ghost or something like that. And she develops an obsession with apologizing about the child's murder and tries to set things right. Denver also realizes that Seth is becoming obsessive and realizes that she has to save one of them. Otherwise, none of them will turn out well. And it really seems like the malevolent spirit of Beloved is coming back to drain the life from Seth. So Denver ends up seeking help from the community, looking for a job to make ends meet, and also reaching out to the community members to help with this this ghost that won't leave the family alone. The community members show up to 124 and they exorcise the ghost, and it apparently flees, and everything seems to be okay. But when Mr. Bodwin shows up, the man that Denver is seeking a job from, Seth has a flashback to her time where the slave catchers were showing up, and she is unable to distinguish Bodwin from the slave catchers in this traumatic flashback, and she attacks Mr. Bodwin. Luckily, the community members intervene before any damage is done, but it's clear that Seth that trauma is still fresh with Seth. A little while later, Seth is bedridden at this point, and Paul D shows up, and he tries to convince her that she's worth it, that she can get over Beloved's death and also her haunting or something like that. And he says that the story ends with Paul D saying that Beloved wasn't the best thing about Seth. Seth was the best thing about Seth. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, Toni Morrison touches upon some pretty heavy themes in this story. She does it pretty well, and she writes the story around those themes pretty well, even if her writing doesn't hold up overall throughout the entire story. So one of the things she touches upon is dehumanization and the horrors of slavery. In the antebellum South, especially in the North too, slaves were not viewed as human. They were viewed the same as cattle. They were breeding stock. They were forced to do work, and if they didn't work, you beat them. And they didn't have any human rights. And it was perfectly normal to sleep with your slaves, or to beat your slaves, or to even kill your slaves. Like you were only affecting yourself because you were out of that money if you ended up killing your slaves. So the slaves had a lot to put up with. Black individuals who were taken from their home or who were born into this slave system had no choice but to accept this terrible fate that was put onto them, and they ended up going through quite a bit. There's an interesting quote that I want to read to you. The nephew, the one who had nursed her while his brother held her down, didn't know he was shaking. His uncle had warned him against that kind of confusion, but the warning didn't seem to be taking. What'd she go and do that for? On account of a beating? Hell, he'd been beat 1,000,000 times and he was white. Once it hurt so bad and made him so mad he smashed the well bucket. Another time he took it out on Samson. A few tossed rocks was all. But no beating ever made him, no way he could have. What'd she go and do that for? And that is what he asked the sheriff, who was standing there amazed like the rest of them, but not shaking. He was swallowing hard over and over again. What'd she want to go and do that for? And so that is around the time the slave catchers caught up to Seth, pretty much asking, why did you go and kill your daughter, or kill her property, essentially? And you get an idea of how the nephew, the white individual, views slaves. Like, he's like, oh, I've been beaten and I've never been gone so far as to kill somebody. And it's kind of highlighting how he's missing the point. Of course he hasn't done that. This doesn't happen to him on a regular basis. He's not made to feel dehumanized and go so far as to have to kill somebody in order to get out of that dehumanization kind of feeling. And so he also feels it's perfectly okay to throw rocks at slaves and push people around. And the nephew is noted as being cruel in this story. He can perhaps because of his plight in the world, he feels the need to target slaves to feel better about himself. And it really gets at how there was no relenting for black individuals during the time of slavery. They had to put up with all these horrors, and this is surely, like, for those who survived the Civil War after that period, there was a lot of trauma to be had for those individuals. To look back and be like, wow, that was a terrible time. How did I survive that? It certainly wouldn't be a good feeling, and especially after the Civil War during Reconstruction, there were still the KKK and other hate groups that rose up to say, you're not equal to us, don't even think about voting, don't even think about trying to ask for equity in the community, because we'll just end up killing you. And so even after slavery, these black individuals had to continue to deal with this oppressive force in America. Even to this day, they still have to deal with this oppressive force. And so what Toni Morrison is getting at is how throughout the story, there's these people who want to forget about these traumatic events. Seth is it's even noted, like, she's at 124 Denver, and this is the part of her life that she wants to remember. She's not hoping to remember when she killed her other daughter and when she lived as a slave. And even Paul D., like, he remembers his time with Seth at Sweet Home, but he doesn't want to be forced to remember all the other stuff that happened to him. It wasn't a pleasant time. Friends died, family died, and nobody was happy. And so there's this hope that maybe you can forge forge forward into the future and not have to deal with the memories of your traumatic slave experience. But again, Toni Morrison highlights how that's not really possible. The character of Beloved shows up precisely because Seth is trying to forget this past. And I think what Morrison is trying to say is we might try to forget these traumatic experiences, especially white individuals in America who try to forget the horrors of slavery, but you can't. Because if you try to forget all of this, it's doomed to repeat itself in some way. Like, black individuals especially can't forget that experience, because you have to remember what your ancestors went through in order to know why you're fighting for the equality that you're fighting for. Slavery might seem like a distant memory, but it was only 150 years ago. There are some generations that are the descendants of slaves who are still around, and so I really like how Toni Morrison gets at all that. Like, she writes it very well, how these individuals suffered and had to persist. They weren't allowed to complain, because if they complained, it was more beatings. And it really, like, it's hard to read too, because it's so upsetting, and you want to do something about it, but you can't go back in time and fight the slavery movement. That's just not possible at this juncture. Maybe when technology becomes available, we can retcon American history, but that's not going to happen now. Another thing that Toni Morrison does really well is writing the tragedy of Beloved. So Beloved is Seth's oldest daughter, who died at a young age. Seth did something really horrible. She saw the slave catchers and her former masters arriving, ready to take her and her children back to Sweet Home, or possibly separate them as a punishment for Seth. And so Seth did the only thing she saw was reasonable at the time. She took her kids to the shed and set about trying to kill each and every one of them, but the only one it worked for, the only child who died, was the oldest at the time, her daughter, who she would later go on to call Beloved, because that was the only name she could provide for her. So my question for you at this point in time out there, and you feel free to sound off in the comments, is there a justification for the tragedy of Beloved? Because Toni Morrison doesn't really offer judgment for Seth's actions. She highlights what it is, letting the characters feel what they feel about that sort of event, but she doesn't directly comment on whether that was right or wrong. And you got to understand where Seth was coming from this. She saw that she would be separated from her children, given it was near the end of the Civil War, but that didn't guarantee that they would ever be reunited again. She saw her being separated from her children forever, her children being sold into a slavery system that oppressed her, again, coming back to that dehumanization feeling, and her wanting to save them from that through any means possible. And the sad part is the only way to do that would be to kill those children. A horrific event, and the other characters react to that. Paul D ends up leaving for a bit. Her two sons, once they start to understand what happened, they just leave the family. Seth believes it's because Beloved is haunting the house, but it's more realistically, it's because they realize that their mom tried to kill them, and they don't know how to deal with that fact, especially because they were probably too young to understand the slavery system that they were born into. So I would say it's a terrible thing that Seth did, but there's a justification behind it that if you can't say it was justified, you can at least understand her reasoning and her argument for going forth in this terrible, terrible thing. And as a result, Seth becomes haunted by Beloved, both by the memory of what she did and by what appears to be a malevolent spirit haunting the house in a ghostly form, and in also later physical form, after Paul D tries to exorcise the ghost. And when Seth realizes that it's Beloved who's this, like her daughter is Beloved, and like this ghost has come back, she tries to obsessively apologize for what has happened. She tries to make some sense of what she did, possibly for herself, but also for Beloved, for her to understand and not to retain this afterlife hatred of the woman who killed her. There's a good quote that I would like to read to you. Denver thought she understood the connection between her mother and Beloved. Seth was trying to make up for the handsaw. Beloved was making her pay for it. But there would never be an end to that, and seeing her mother diminish shamed and infuriated her, yet she knew Seth's greatest fear was the same one Denver had in the beginning, that Beloved might leave, that before Seth could make her understand what it meant, what it took to drag the teeth of that saw under the little chin, to feel the baby blood pump like oil in her hands, to hold her face so her head would stay on, to squeeze her so she could absorb still the death spasms that shot through that adored body, plump and sweet with life. Beloved might leave. Leave before Seth could make her realize what worse than that, far worse, was what baby Suggs died of, what Ella knew, what Stamp saw, and what made Paul D. tremble, that anybody white could take your whole self for anything that came to mind, not just work, kill or maim you, but dirty you so bad you couldn't like yourself anymore. And that's a very powerful passage. Some of Toni Morrison's best writing in the entire book, and really solid. Something I really enjoy. But it gets at Seth's obsession. It's not just enough to convince her daughter that she's sorry. She also wants to let her daughter know that she did this because she wanted to save her from this world that was going to just spit on her and take away her innocence, dirty her, so to speak, give her the same plight as baby Suggs, to go through her entire life and just to have everything taken away, even every little bit of yourself. And sure, slavery ended, but that didn't change the fact that there was so much oppression for black individuals in America. That if you weren't being a slave, you were oppressed in other ways. That your human rights are being taken away one by one. And I like that aspect of that story. This ghost showing up and Seth realizing the truth is an opportunity to make amends, but that's never going to happen because Beloved can't accept an apology from beyond the grave, especially if she's a ghost. And if there's the other instance of the story, is Beloved really a ghost, or is she just a random passerby who, with a case of mistaken identity, like she can't apologize because it isn't her apology to make, or isn't her apology to accept. There's also a lot to be said about generational trauma in this story. Specifically how baby Suggs passes down her trauma to Seth, and Seth passes down her trauma to Denver. Will Denver break the cycle? Although baby Suggs is Seth's mother-in-law, she was born into the slavery system and lived her whole life as a slave. Seth lived part of her life as a slave. She was very fortunate in the fact that slavery ended midway through her life, and Denver only lived a few years in the slavery system. So each one has this trauma being passed down through them, trying to break the cycle of wallowing in this despair, from everything that I mentioned earlier, from the tragedy of Beloved to the dehumanization feel that is constantly being passed through. And Denver, for her part, does try, but the story ends before we're able to see Denver's life lived out, and I honestly don't think that she'd be able to escape that generational trauma, that the 400 years, no, not 400 years, but the almost 200 years of slavery just doesn't go away through one generation, and it still hasn't left the culture that we're currently living in. So if I had to make a guess, Denver's life, although she tries to live a better life, I don't think it's actually quite possible for her yet, until, America answers for the heinous actions it did during the slavery movement. The last thing I want to talk about are the things that I didn't like about the story, and one of them is the confusing writing. This writing is really hard to get into. I felt it was pretty similar to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and that Toni Morrison had a tendency to draw on and on and on and on. And she often weaved through the past and present in a very confusing manner, often in the same paragraph. And so it was hard to follow where we were in the story, as she talks a lot about Hallie, Seth's husband who died, but the story just drops away from him, and it's never really clear what she's trying to say with Hallie or anything else. And I don't like the writing. It's hard to get into. I wouldn't say it's bad. My problem is it's hard to follow, and it's very wordy, and Toni Morrison is very verbose, and it's very difficult to get into this writing. It's a struggle to read, and I find that it's boring at times. And the other thing I don't like is the characters, especially Seth and Beloved and Paul D. They're all kind of annoying, to be honest. They don't seem to do anything in a normal human kind of behavior. Just a bunch of weird actions, and like, since they're so inclined to believe in slaves, why don't they immediately assume that this mysterious woman who shows up to their house, especially in a community where they're ostracized, is already a ghost? Like, it's clear that it should be a ghost, and maybe that's because I'm on the outside looking in, but it just creates a bunch of characters and a bunch of writing that feels kind of uneven to me, and I don't quite know how to reconcile all of that. The best I can compare this to is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. She wrote a story about slavery and used time travel, whereas here ghost is used as the thing that holds the story together. And I think that Butler does a better job of writing and creating characters that we want to follow, while extrapolating on the same themes of dehumanization and doing anything to protect your loved ones against those who would seek to do you wrong. So ultimately, I would suggest, like, Kindred is a much better story that tries at the same thing, whereas this does a good job, but it kind of falls flat at various points throughout the story. Anyway, we're nearing 30 minutes, so I should finally find a way to end this giant ramble that I've been going on. I would say overall, I would say I kind of recommend this story. It's hard to get into, and I'm not a fan of the writing, but I think you yourself, mysterious watcher out there, might get into the story and find the writing to be a bit better. But I myself struggle with this, but I don't necessarily think that's bad. Like, this isn't a bad book by any means. It's just not something that I'm into, which is a shame, because this seems like a huge cultural touchstone, something that everyone should read in order to understand more about how America got this way and understand the experience of African Americans in the United States. So if you read this before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, absolutely do so below. I would love to hear from you. Let's have a discussion about this interesting book. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about Beloved and Toni Morrison. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and ghostly travels. Farewell.